So looking at a truss roof for preparation and installation of trusses. So this is just a SketchUp drawing that I have. I'm just going to remove the plywood there, but you can kind of see some of the components that are going into place there. If you're not familiar, like this here would be a regular truss that we can see. Then we have a ladder here. We have a gable end. So gable end is a triangular piece that closes off the end. We got a strong back here. You have another strong back sitting down the middle of the building. We've got a lateral brace sitting here as well. We have a diagonal brace coming down that ties into the strong back, which holds your gable end plumb. So kind of what I'm going to do there is remove some of these components and kind of get it right down to the bare structure, and then we'll actually go over doing some of the layouts. I'm just going to turn off some of these layers. Get ourselves down to the bare structure. The ridge blocking. Just correct that before I move on here. Ridge blocking. So we'll shut that off. So we're going to take off the backing, the ladders. They'll leave there. My strong back is gone. Okay, it's a different word there. Okay, so kind of where we want to be here. So we have our building that's 24 by 38. This would be our exterior walls. I kind of just have them up just a little bit to say that we have them up a little bit. So your trusses would show up onto the job site. You might grab your gable ends. You might sheet those gable ends while they're down on the ground. One of the first components that goes into place is that gable end. We normally attach that gable end to a strong back. So this here is a strong back. So it's just two 2x6s nailed together. The height that they extend beyond the top of the wall is typically the gable end height minus about 6 inches. So if I were to throw the gable end in there just quickly, so when this was sitting down on the ground, if I measure from the very peak here to the very bottom core of that gable end and take off 6 inches, that's how much I'd want that strong back to be extended above the wall. So I don't want that to be up in the way up here. So basically take off 6 inches so that it's not in the way. And then what we want to do is we want to nail this to the wall. So normally this wall is 8 feet high. Right now it's only about 4 feet. But I want to get 2 good nails here into the top plates or structural screws. And then I'd want that to extend down at least to the floor system. And again, a couple of screws into there. So if it ends up needing to be longer than 16 feet, we are allowed to just kind of manipulate those. You'd have maybe an 8-footer on this section and make that one 16, and then from there extend that all the way down to kind of stagger your joint. So this strong back is basically like being a lifeline. What's then going to happen is our gable end is going to nail onto it, and then from there that becomes like the anchor point, and then all other trusses will then anchor off of that point. So if this were to fail, basically the entire building could fall down. So this has to be a really strong component. Normally if this here exceeds about 10 feet, you'd probably want to brace that back down to the ground. So have a brace nailed off here, coming down the ground, and then nailed into a picket. If that brace ends up being longer than 16 feet, you might want to brace it on either side so it can't bow as well. Okay, I do have pictures in the PowerPoint that kind of explain that detail a little bit, so we can go over those when we get to it. So strong back's in, it's nailed off. The gable end is sheathed. For my example, the gable end is not actually sheathed, but the gable end, we're going to pretend like it's sheathed, so the sheathing is flush to the other sheathing on the lower section. From there, we're ready to start doing our layout. So to be able to do our layout, we kind of need to understand some of the components. So I'm going to drop that gable back in. I'm going to put the first truss in, truss number 1. And then if you kind of look at it, truss number 1 is a little bit higher than the gable end. There's actually room here for the ladder to sit on top. So if I throw the ladder in, the ladder will fill that space. So put the ladder on the wrong side. I'll put ladder right, and so it fills that space. You see what I'm saying there? So the ladder gets nailed into the first truss. The gable end is 3.5 inches lower because it's a 2x4 ladder, and then that then also creates our projection. How far does the roof project beyond the wall? Right, so that's the ladder there. That's a separate component, just like that. So if I were to get rid of truss 1 and gable end, so get rid of truss 1 and the gable end, that's what the ladder would look like. There might be a joint on it, might be 2 pieces, like a joint right through, so that's 1 piece, that's a second piece, but that's an assembly, right? That gets nailed on to the first truss. So if we put the first truss back in place, put the gable end back in place, that's kind of the starting point to our roof. I'll put the ladder on the left there. But basically from there, we have trusses at 2 feet on center. So if I toss in the second truss here, and then the third truss, we're well on our way there to start dropping those components in place. But to be able to get this layout, we actually have to look at how big is the ladder, right? So the ladder dictates where the first truss goes. Once we know where the first truss goes, we go 2 feet on center from there until we get to the other end of the building. So whenever the truss package shows up at the job site, the ladder's already made. We just have to measure from this point to that point. So in this case, it's 40 inches. And that's basically where we're going to establish our first layout line for our layout for our trusses. So now I'm going to remove all those components so I can get to the layout. We'll leave the strong back there, but ladder right and left can disappear. And we'll get rid of the gable end. So now we have the bare structure. Okay, so we know that our ladder is 40 inches. So typically when I'm doing this layout, what I like to do is avoid doing math. I like to leave my measuring tape stick out here about, in this case, 16 inches. So if you check on the plan, how far is your projection? Normally that'll be on the plan. So in this case, it's going to be 16 inches from the sheathing. So I'm going to leave my tape hang out 16 inches. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark 40 inches. That's going to tell me where that first truss goes. I'd put an X on this side of that line if I was able to. It's not as easy to do with SketchUp there. But if I show you, I just click on truss 1, that's where it's going to sit, right there, right on that line, on that side of the line. Okay? So my ladder's 40, so I leave my tape out 16, and then I mark 40 inches. And then from there, I would then go 2 feet on center, so basically 24, 48, 72, 96, and then so forth till I get to the other end of the building, basically 2 feet on center. Okay. From there, I would do the same layout on the other side. I'd do the same layout on the other side of the building, all the way to the other end of the building. And then we're kind of ready to start putting these components up in place. Okay, so we got the strong back in, we got our layout done, and I'm going to pretend like it's done the rest of the way. Basically, then the first component that would go in would be your gable end. So one thing that I like to do is use up my scraps and actually install drywall backing right here. So I'm going to find that drywall backing. I think it's called backing. So you can see it's just a 2x6. And normally it's a bunch of scraps, so it's not a full-length piece. It's a bunch of scraps. So if I have a 2x6 wall here, I'm going to use a 2x6 for backing. If it's 2x4 wall here, I'm going to use 2x4 for backing. So basically what you do there is you measure in 1.5 inches, right? That wall should have already been straightened and braced. If you measured an 1.5 inches, both ends, chalk a line, nail that backing on top of that wall. What I can then do is drop my gable end in. My gable end is going to be sitting right up against that, and I can nail my gable end right into that. So one thing that's also doing is it's adding backing for drywall. So if I kind of go underneath here and look up, now my strapping on my ceiling can nail off to that. Okay, so it's doing two things. It's creating like a stopping point, for my gable end. So when I go to install my gable end, it has something to nail to now. And something to stop it from going too far. But it also adds as a nailer for my strapping on the underside. Okay, so that would get installed first. I'd have a really good strong connection here, so some good nails up here to make sure that that can't fall over. Because of the height of this, probably would be a good idea to brace this back down to the ground if it was a fairly windy day. Remembering that this gable end here is sheeted on the ground, so it's like a big sail up in the air. Okay, so a good brace this direction into a picket would not hurt for a temporary brace. Okay, from there I would probably drop in my second truss. So more than likely, I tend to use a crane to put my trusses up. So I would actually have a crane put this in place. So there'd be a cable attached to a crane here, holding that up in place. I'd have one person on this side of the building, one person on that side of the building, either on scaffolds or wall jacks of some sort. So the crane would still be holding it. At this point, I would try to determine what my projection is supposed to be on the eave here. So you can see that I actually chalked a line on one side of the building. So normally I chalk that line on the side that's going to be most exposed by people coming into the house. So if there's a sidewalk here, front door here, that's the side I want to make perfectly straight. So normally what I do is just make a random number. So I measure over 2 inches here, measure over 2 inches at the far end, and I snap that chalk line. And then what I do is try to determine what we need for a projection here. So I'm pretty sure that this one here was 16 inches. So from the wall to the finished fascia would be 16 inches. So from the wall to the end of the truss would be 14 and a half, because the fascia is 1.5 inches thick. So what I would do is, while that's sitting up in place, I would measure from the wall to the tail. I get the partner on the other side to do the same thing, measure from the wall to the tail, see if we have the same. Right? 14 and a half here, 14 and a half here. If not, let's split the difference, make it the same. So we might have to shift this gable end to match that, right? So, so let's say for some reason this was 14 and a quarter. What I might do is shift that gable end over 1/4 inch as well to line up with that. Or just keep it tacked, right? If that gable end's only tacked for now, maybe one nail here, one in the middle, one at the far end. When we put that ladder on, we can kind of tweak to see how that's going to work out. Okay. And another thing that I do prior to installing my roof is I make sure that I check to see that my ladder fits between my gable and my truss. Maybe explain that later or in class, but that's something you should check as well. Sometimes the gable end here has to be modified a little bit to allow the ladder to sit correctly. Okay, we'll leave that for now though. So once I know that I have 14 and a half here and I have 14 and a half here, what I would then do is, so if it had to be modified, I'd modify it. But in this case, let's say it's 14 and a half both sides. That means I'm happy with that. So what I would then do is, before the next truss comes up, I would actually mark. So I'd hook onto here, and I would measure 14 and a half plus 2 inches, so 16 and a half. So I put that little pencil line right there on the truss while it's on the ground. So that way there I know next time that the second truss comes up, that little pencil line is going to have to touch the chalk line as well as my layout line for my 24-inch on center. Okay. So that one there already has a mark, but if I show you truss number 2, you see how it has a mark on it? It's sitting right on that line. So what that's going to do is, because this peak is too high, right? If this peak was lower to the ground, I could run a string line down the peak and make sure all my trusses line up at the peak. That's quite high in the air. So it's easier for me to make sure that my tails right now are all lined up, and that's how I'm doing it. I'm measuring from the tail 16 and a half inches, and I'm making sure that the mark on the truss lines up with this chalk line, making every single truss parallel to that chalk line. So I normally only tack my trusses just in case, once they're all up, we'll kind of climb up to the top and get a string line across the peaks. Make sure that they look nice and consistent. And then we'll kind of split the difference between the bottom here and the peak to making sure they're as close as they possibly can be. Okay. But in the meantime, so I'm kind of going to backtrack here, back to just the first gable end. So when I had that first gable end in, I said I locked that in, making it solid. That becomes like an anchor. Then I put in truss number 2 in. Truss number 1. We then nail this off temporarily because it might have to be shifted back and forth. Nail that one off temporarily. Then what I would do is I would take a strapping and I would nail the strapping from this point to that point. Right, so I'd measure the distance in between these two trusses. Whatever I have between those two trusses, I'm going to do the same at the top. And then I'm going to nail off a strapping maintaining that distance. Okay. Now what that does, so I do it as close as I can to the top. What that does is it locks truss 1 to the gable end. The gable end is locked to the strong back. I then could drop in truss number 2. Okay. Then I pre-make strappings. Right. So I pre-make these strappings that are 4 feet. Oh, strapping didn't come on. Why is this strapping not on? Huh. Weird. Not good. Anyway, so there was strapping that I had there that's not appearing for some reason. Maybe it's under the roof sheathing row 3. Let's have a look there. Maybe that's not coming on. Oh. So there's something glitching here, which is too bad. Maybe I'll throw the plywood on roof sheathing. No, it might pop up. For some reason. Let's see if I turn everything on, see if that'll come back. So it's not the plywood. Too bad this is happening. So it's not the plywood. Let's just get everything on for a second here. Nothing. Trusses. Strong back. Oh, so it's connected to the strong back. So that's the stuff there that I wanted. Strapping 1, strapping 2. Okay, so we'll get rid of. Okay, so get rid of those ladders. Back to left and right are not needed. So that's kind of where we were. I'll get rid of that lateral brace down the middle. worry about that for now, but it shouldn't really be there right now. So we got the gable end in. We've tied the gable end to the truss number 1. Then that strapping would come in, right? So we get rid of these strappings here. So those are the pieces one at a time. So I make those prior to the crane showing up. I cut them at 4 feet. I get the nails already set into them. And then I would then, this gable end is tied to the strong back. This truss is tied to this truss with a strapping. Now I know that from the rest of the way I'm going to be 2 feet on center. So that's why I make these strappings 4 feet on center, so that I can then just tack them off fairly quickly. So the nails are already set, the marks are already set. I didn't bother for in here, so that's why that's all. Right, but basically, I have a mark at 2 feet, so I got 2 nails here, 2 nails here, and 2 nails here. That truss was already tacked off to this one, so I nailed to it, which then ties this truss to that truss. So truss 3 wouldn't be there yet, right? You only go basically 1 truss at a time. But what I would do is, right, this is tied with the strapping. The crane brings in truss 2. Crane's still holding it. I grab strapping number 1. I could put 2 nails here, put 2 nails here, then jump down to the bottom, get that nailed off in the right location. Get that nailed off the right location, take a piece of strapping, do the same thing on the far side. Now that's kind of locked. You try to get that strapping as high as you can reach, right? The better off you can. Then what I would do is get truss number 3 into play. So truss number 3 comes in. I nail that one off, okay? Normally you double back right away at that moment, right? So we're not allowed to put a strapping at the end of the piece. We got to double back. So, and then what I do there, so I'm locking these 2 trusses really securely. And then what it's doing is it's extending out far enough to reach truss 4. Okay? So again, 2 nails here, 2 nails here, there's 2 nails already. And then the crane brings in truss 4. I think I have them all attached there. So truss 4 comes in, right, obviously 1 at a time. And then we continue to follow with strapping 3, doubling back. Then truss 5 would come in, and then so forth until we get to the other end of the building. So all the trusses would be in, then the gable end would be in at the far end. From there we could, so probably before I threw all those trusses up, I probably would only had 4 here. So I can't put the 4th one in, otherwise they all show up. I'll just remove some of that strapping. But at this stage of the game, right before that 4th truss goes in, I want to make sure I solidify this whole section so it can't collapse. So what I might do is throw a strong back down the center. Okay, so that strong back gets nailed into the gable end truss. As you can see, there's 2 good nails down into the gable end truss. Whatever spacing I have between these 2 trusses, I do the same here and then put 2 nails. And then from there it's 24 inches over, 2 nails. 24 inches over, 2 nails. Again, I'd have that 4th truss there more than likely. 24 inches over, 2 nails. Then what I could do is get a plate level or a long level and a straight edge, and I want to make sure I level off this gable end. So I'll get a diagonal brace in there. So brace, which is going to go from the top of the gable end down to that strong back. So I'm going to get 2 good nails up into here. Then I'm going to get that long level on there, make sure that's nice and plumb. Once that's plumb, so we can pull on it or push on it and get that nailed off to the strong back. For good security, a lot of times I'll carry that right down to the floor. Right, so it's going to be a 16-footer and another 16-footer overlap, probably by 4 feet, to a block on the floor. So you can see if I had that 4th truss in there, that would work. Right, so I'd have to have the 4th truss first, and then that 16-footer would fit nice. Okay. So what that's doing is making sure that this section of the building is nice and strong. Another thing I might do is throw in my lateral braces. So if I have enough people there to speed up the process, throw in some lateral braces, right? So lateral brace down the center of that span, a lateral brace down the center of that span. If I need lateral bracing in my webs, I might throw that in as well. Typically you need like a diagonal here as well. So from here down on a 45-degree angle and here down on a 45-degree angle, to lock that. So both those compression webs, that's compression web, that's a tension web here. So compression web, if it exceeds a certain distance, requires lateral bracing, but they also typically require an X bracing there at a 20-foot interval. So every 20 feet I'm required to put an X here. Go over 20 feet, another X, to lock all that structure together. Okay. We'll throw the rest of the trusses in there. So that all that bracing would have to be completed. I'm also, when I can, throwing a lateral brace at the very, very top of the building as well. That's the way I like to do it. Some people like to put blocking up there. So that's another option. So if you don't want to do that lateral, so that's a piece kind of in between, right? So it's nailed into the truss component, so the tension web. Some people like to put blocking up there. I threw in a couple of those blocks just so you kind of see what it looks like. Backing, no blocking. Ridge blocking right there. So ridge blocking, so some people throw the ridge blocking in, so that you'd have to continue that to get to the other end, but basically keeping the pieces apart, the appropriate distance. A lot of people do that. A lot of people nail these on before the truss comes up on the ground, and when they come up, you just finish off nailing them from the other side. So this truss would have that attached on the ground. It'd be lifted into place, and then you would just nail it off when it gets up there. So a lot of people do that as well. So once all your bracings are kind of in, you've kind of locked things, then you could probably get up there and start playing around and throw the ladders in, right? So the ladder on the right would go in at this stage, right? So at this point, if everything's braced off, all my trusses are in theory, the crane could leave, right? So the ladders can be lifted up afterwards when the crane leaves. But you don't want to be wasting time doing ladders whenever the crane is there. They're a little bit time consuming. So that's something that I would suggest, getting all your structure up, braced, solid, and then from there so we want to do the same thing at the far end there. We want to get a strong back up, a diagonal brace, which I think I have there. Get your laterals in all the way, get your strong back all the way, and then the crane can leave, okay? And from there we can actually take in the ladders, start nailing those on. Right, so those are a thing that a lot of people get installed incorrectly. But normally the ladder gets nailed to this truss first, right? So 2 nails here, and then work yourself up in like a 16-inch increment, 2 nails, make sure it's flush, another 16 inches over, nail it off, go up 16 inches, make sure it's flush, nail it, go up 16 inches, make sure it's flush, nail it, till you get all the way to the top. So start from one end, nailing, go all the way to the top. Now there you can kind of use it like a prying tool up and down to make it nice and straight. From there, we'd have to establish two layout lines. We need to know that this is 16 inches from here to that gable end. So we have to put a mark at 16. And then we also need to know where the ladder goes in this direction. So the easiest way to know where the ladder goes in this direction is to bring a nail over here somewhere, right at the center of the peak, stretch the string line across here. So you're basically going to make sure that the string line touches the peak of all these trusses. And then also what you're going to do is then bring those ladders to meet that string line. So the string line is stretched across. You bring the ladder to that string line, and then we can put a mark here. So we have to make sure that that's 16 inches. So from the fascia, put a mark on here at 16. So we'll have to move the gable to follow that line. Then we have to move the ladder up and down to follow the string line. So it's a little difficult. Another thing we could do is if we have a nice straight edge, we could tack a straight edge following the peak and extend it as far as we can. Right, so a long 2x4, 2x6 that's straight, or a chunk of plywood that's nice and straight could be tacked off the edge here, and we just bring that ladder to line up with that piece of plywood. That might be easier if you're working by yourself. So then we just have to make sure that ladder goes up until it lines up with the plywood. Then we have to make sure that we have a mark at 16 inches, and then we can put 2 nails on either side of that 2x4. And then we come down to the next horizontal piece, Again, mark 16. We can't chalk a line here because nothing's straight, so we have to measure over 16 inches. And we can then nail that off. Measure over 16 inches, then we can nail that off. 16 inches, we can nail that off. Then we have to go to the ladder on the other side and basically do the same thing. Right? That straight edge is still there. Bring that in line with it. That should line up. So we'll measure over 16, put a mark, move the gable end to follow that mark, nail. Put a mark at 16, move the gable end to follow that mark, nail until we get to the bottom. Do the same at the far end. And then we're basically ready for fascia, right? So we have to make sure all that's lined up. We could throw a block here, so a ridge block from here to here. I normally put a ridge block from here to here, and then I follow with lateral bracing the rest of the way. Some people put that ridge blocking the entire length and skip this lateral brace. I find the lateral brace stronger. I feel safer with it there, as opposed to relying on end nails from truss to truss. Just throw that ridge blocking so it kind of looks like that's complete. I skip those two. Wouldn't bother with those two. This lateral brace should extend to this one. It's not, for some reason it's not being tied there, so I could extend that pretty easily. I'll just kind of pull it over there so it's at the right spot. We extend that over to this truss, and then there it is. Okay. So I think we're going to stop right there. We'll get the fascia on another video, and then maybe look at putting some plywood on